It's challenge time again, and this one is a small feat. It's a common misconception that these tiny figures have to be painted with the tiniest brushes. And what most people give as first-time buyer advice is that you actually want a larger brush to handle most of the work and only save the tiny brush for the little details. And I agree. But what if that advice is ignored and instead they buy only the smallest brush that they can? What would it be like to paint a miniature like that? Well, in this challenge, I'm about to find out because I'm only allowed to use one brush. And it's the smallest one I own. I figured since I have to use a small brush, I might go with a thin model. This guy had the perfect build for this challenge, though there's still a lot of surface to cover on his overcoat, so I'm not getting off scot-free. But lots of nice little details too, where a small brush will be most useful. As for which brush I get to use, I actually have two that are kind of the same size, at least when it comes to thickness. The big difference between them is bristle length. The Green Stuff World Gold is a very long bristle, which is normally my preference, but since smallest means smallest, that honor defaults to the Series 7 000. Also, just so I couldn't be accused of cheating with a primer coat or something to make it easier on myself, I'm doing him a neutral gray, so anything I want a specific color has to be base coated in it first. First thing I'm going to do then is actually base coat his pants and boots with black. The reference I'm using for this scheme is pretty dark, so I want to keep the recesses as dark as possible, therefore black. It's actually not too bad using the small brush to do the base coating, for this area at least. They're thin enough that I don't need to spread the black too far. Black itself is opaque, so I don't need much either. That said, after a while of going back for more and more paint, I did start to take globs of black on the brush, the kind I'd wipe away under normal circumstances, and use that as the starting pool to pull paint from, so I wouldn't have to go back to the palette as often. But that said, I only needed about 3 of those pools to finish. Here's a comparison to why you'd want to do steps like this with a larger brush. Since it holds more paint in its belly, and spreads wider as it's wiped along the model, this guy has more surface area, but with that large brush we're able to cover his whole leg in a quarter of the time. This is where most new painters fall trap of the idea that you need a really small brush to paint miniatures, and it can be pretty frustrating trying to cover a large area, especially with transparent colors, with a small brush like the one I'm using, which we'll get to see me do soon enough. For the pants, I want to go with a really desaturated khaki color, so to do that it's as simple as just adding a bone to make the gray instead of a pure white, since it already has some of the yellow that makes khaki in it. This is where this brush makes sense. The small folds of the pants are just the right size for this brush, where it spreads out a little bit as well to get an even layer. The only thing I found myself doing more than my other brushes was going back to the palette a bit more often, but as far as the painting goes, it was just fine. As I layered the paint and brightened it up by adding more and more of the bone, I came to a point where I needed to glaze to blend out the layers a bit. The first thing about making a glaze with this brush is it doesn't make a very big area on the palette, so while it's easy enough to add water, I'm gonna have to work fast before this dries out on me. For a glaze, I don't want it really wet like a wash, and since I'm going with just a damp brush and paint, I was worried it'd dry on the brush too fast. But this one kinda solved itself, in that by the time it would have started to dry, I needed to go back to the palette to reload it anyway, rehydrating it. For the rest of his lower body, I want it dark, pretty much black, but just so it's not pure black and gray, I'm mixing in a tiny amount of orange to the black. That way, as I mix in the white, it just offsets it to a very slight brown. I start with this mix all over the boots again. I don't need it to get into the deep recesses, as those are already pure black, so this little brush is great for maneuvering around things I don't want to touch. But I have to load it so many times as I do, so that's a point in the good and bad columns for this step. After, I mix in some white and do the outlining. This again was in the little brush's favor, as it's meant to work on these kind of fine lines, and so did its job perfectly. By the time I ran out of paint in the bristles for any particular line, it was probably time to stop painting that line anyway, if I was trying to keep it dark. I did do glazes again with it as well, just a half step between the lighter gray and the starting layer, and the brush was actually nice for control on the flatter parts. It allowed me to smooth those out really nicely. The other thing this brush was actually really useful for was stippling some of these edges. So as I did some more of the lining, I'd stipple a few dots outward from them for texture, and normally I'm a little too heavy-handed with these, but because this little brush ran out of paint before I could go overboard, it gave me a chance to think and say to myself, no, that's enough. Last thing to do was to dot these edge points, and well, of course it excelled at that, because this kind of thing is what you'd want this precision for. His jacket here has two parts, an outside and a slightly longer inside. Now I already know I want the jacket a red maroon, but the references I'm using don't really have two jackets like this guy does, so it's up to me to come up with the color. On either side of red on the color wheel is purple and orange. Orange and black make brown, so a nice brown leather would still be harmonious. But I'm feeling a bit wild and went with the purple side of things, and even more wild than that, a magenta. Since it still needs to be dark, I did mix it with quite a punch of black, which I would have done if it were on the orange side of things too. To apply the first layer, the inside here is where I think the little brush will struggle the most. But on the nice side of things, its short bristles and nice tip actually make it pretty easy to get behind things without worry about getting paint on already painted parts. So it was actually kind of nice in a way to base with this for things deep in the model. Though I did have to load it more often, it felt safe in a way. Like it was almost impossible to make a mistake with. And for the second coat, since it was just to reinforce, I could saturate the bristles and let them really spread out. So that was easy too. I start with some shading on this one, just grabbing a dot of black on the tip of the wet little brush and dabbing that in the deep shadows and just using the brush's moisture to pull it out. It really didn't have a problem doing this either, as it held just the right amount of water even when fully hydrated. Now to highlight this jacket, instead of white I'm going to use this kind of lighter brown, just so it doesn't end up too magenta towards the light side of things. And to get it on, I'd figured this would be a good test of how well this little brush stipples over larger flat surfaces. This is where the shorter bristle really works well. With my longer brushes, when I stipple with them, they can end up with lines more than dots, but because this one doesn't bend as much when you press on it, it leaves a more controlled dot where I choose to put them. For the highlights, I just continue adding texture with the stippling, just adding more of that brown each time. Then to finish it off, I was to glaze a bit just to reduce some of the stippling's harshness, thinning out my base layer and using the accuracy of the little brush to only glaze the areas around the highlight points, between the shadows and lightest surfaces. It didn't have too much problem with this, but there was a few times the glaze ran out before I was expecting it to and split the bristles a bit. So a quick rinse and back to the palette and it was good. One more step before the overcoat, and no, this isn't me just procrastinating away from having to do the large base coat of the jacket. Okay, well maybe it is a little, but I'd rather get the metal done on his chest before the coat so I'm not dancing around the coat to do it later. I'm starting with a pretty washy base of a black and this pastel blue. The little brush can get it on the model just fine, but I do have to go back to load it often. The only problem here is the color mix itself. It's drying quite a bit lighter than I expected. This is supposed to be my dark base coat. Also, the elbow broke away and only the cable below it is holding those parts together, so it's a bit wobbly. I fixed that off camera with some glue, but now I had to deal with the lightness problem. So heck it, let's see if this little brush can really wash. So some common advice for when it comes to washes is to control the pooling so that it only pools where you want it. Well, I guess I can add to that. If you use the smallest brush, you won't have to worry about pooling. Ever. Kind of a blessing for this model, but I really couldn't get enough wash on any single part to have it really pool at all. For me, that's alright, because I'm just trying to darken it a bit, but it would be a bit silly if you're trying to go for a heavy contrast wash. I also have to load this brush over and over and over and over and over again. Even just his hand, I found myself going back to the pot for more wash on every finger. Now, I'll be the first to say that I'm not very good at non-metal metal. It's something I still really have to work on, but I've been watching some others' videos to see if I can at least do a little better this time. Starting with my base color again, I kind of block in the areas I think I should have had the highest reflection, mostly just the top of the arm plates and rounded edges. Then using the pastel blue, go over it again, but this time a little less, the brush working just fine for this as I needed to be detailed anyway. After, a bit of a thin glaze to bring it all together some before the extreme highlights. And this is actually where the brush struggles a bit for me. White has a tendency to dry fast, especially in my climate where all the paints dry fast. And the more white I add to the mix to get to these extreme highlights, the more I end up having to reset the brush because it's dried in the middle of me trying to get it on the model. So luckily I don't need that much white for the effect, but it was frustrating for me a little bit as I tried to do the final lining along the edges. Alright, I guess I can't put it off any longer. Time for the part I was dreading the most. Time to base coat his jacket. Luckily my color choice will help a lot here, as I know from my previous video, red oxide and black goes over anything in one coat. But even just the first few swipes I knew this was going to take a long time. The little brush can spread out just fine to cover a large area, but can only hold enough paint for a very small one. So it's a case of going back and forth over and over again to load up the brush and swipe it on the model. Sometimes having to rinse the whole thing off because paint was sitting on the fur roll too long. Something like this might have only taken 1 or 2 brushfuls with a large brush. I will give the little guy a bit of credit though. It was really nice for getting areas behind these tubes and along tight edges, as you still had the control of a small brush, but the wide areas made me want to grab my number 2 so many times. As far as highlighting goes, I thought a stippling like I did for the other part of the cloak would be best, but in an even more condensed area. So I just picked out a few good spots around the cloak that I knew would work with a highlight, and left the rest pretty much alone, to come back to with a darker wash later, as I did still want this pretty dark. The stippling went on kind of more opaque than expected, so I did a few glazes just to tie it into the background a bit better before moving on to the next step, which was to add some of the same brown I used on the purple into the red and stipple in those highlights. With stippling, brush size isn't really the factor when it comes to how much time it takes. So in this case, it's really just a preference on how the tip of the brush works for you. So large or small, I think this would have taken about the same amount of time. So it was only really the base coat that was the annoying part here. After the final highlight stippling, I do a glaze over those highlight points to bring them back together one more time before moving on to the shadows. I add more black to my starting base coat, then thin the paint to just above a glaze consistency, then basically adding it to anywhere I didn't highlight, pulling it with the little brush to the deepest recesses. Because the base already had black mixed into it, this does its thing pretty quickly, so luckily I only need the single pass. Though in a few of these really darkest parts I did the tip of black thing that I did with the boots just to really make them dark. So there's a long way to go on the miniatures bits and pieces still, but I think we've got all we need to know out of the brush. I'll still be finishing the whole model with it, but since I'll just have the same things to say about it, instead I'll just do a quick rundown of the color recipe used to get to the final spin. For the staff, brain plates, back, and arm cable, I just did those the same metallic blue I did the other metallic parts. For the gold on the staff and shoulder part, I started with the black, then used a dark camo green with a brown mixed in for a more necrotic gold, then mixed in yellow ochre to start highlighting, and mixed in white to get to my brightest points. For the face, I used the same pastel blue with a dark phthalo turquoise mixed in, then just added a bit of white for nose and lip highlights a couple of times. For the brain, I started with a base of the red oxide, but then washed it with Argrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil on the shadowy side, then added white to highlight points around it. This was the underlayer for a bright red, and used red ink and crimson to glaze over top. For the eyes, I used the dark turquoise to base, then used an opaque yellow to dot them with a pupil. As for the tubing and the light from the staff, those can really be whatever you prefer. I went with random colors for my tubes, and green stippled to white for the staff glow. Of course, all using that little brush. I think in this case I really chose the right model to try this challenge out on. I needed the fine tip more than I didn't. But that said, there's a lot of points where I really would have preferred to use a larger brush, or even my airbrush. I will puff out my chest a little and say that that's probably some of the best non-metal metal I've ever done, and I think I have that little brush to thank. By making me work small, I was able to keep my heavy hand at bay, and actually keep the contrast between the dark colors and the super bright highlights. So while I've proven you can paint a miniature with just a small brush, it's not the best tool for all the jobs. So when you do go brush hunting, get a small one, but get him a big brother too, to take on the big brother jobs. Thanks for joining me on this challenging adventure. If you want to see me take on other challenges like this one, please subscribe. But until next time, please have fun with your own painting journey.